Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast supported by Pragati, a flagship media initiative of the Takshashila Institution. We're a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like to bring a fresh perspective to Indian affairs and an Indian perspective to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Hello and welcome to another episode of All Things Policy. My name is Sudisha, and I'm a junior research scholar with the Takshashila Institution, working for the 20 Million Jobs Project. In this project, my colleagues and I work on the policy framework which can establish 20 million jobs in India every year, which is the need of the hour. In the last podcast, we talked about the problems in Bihar when it comes to unemployment, why unemployment exists in Bihar. Maybe there's a possibility that the riots which are happening in Bihar or otherwise in India are caused because of unemployment. And what are the impacts of unemployment in Bihar, such as spousal violence or law and order situation? For part 2 today, we have a very special guest called Srijay. Srijay is a third-year student at Ashoka University and was well recommended by Arushi Kataria, who is another person that I work with in the podcast. Hi, Srijay. Welcome to our podcast.
Hi, Sudisha. Thank you for having me.
Sure. So, Srijay, let's get straight to the point. So, I think the first question that I want to ask you is that you're from Bihar and your dad is an IPS officer in Bihar as well. So, you know the ground reality of the state better than anyone else. So, I think I would want you to expand on the law and order situation. What's the unemployment like in Bihar? And what are some things that, let's say, someone like me who's not been to Bihar, but I've just read literature on it, and then I'm, conjecturing about it. So I want to understand your perspective for someone who who was raised in Bihar and whose father also works there. What's the unemployment and law and order situation like?
Well, the situation is quite grim, as many analysts have noted, and there's a very menacing desperation among the youth, especially because some of them really cannot afford to migrate elsewhere for jobs or education. And the opportunities in Bihar itself are quite limited within the public sector, because that is the most aspirational as of now among the youth. And it is closely followed by engineering or medical professions. But as you know, the commonality between all these three spheres of employment is that they fail to absorb the entirety of the workforce because it is very competitive and the jobs are also skilled. So a lot of candidates for this reason are left out, and many of them have master's degrees, even PhDs, but they have to apply for jobs which are like basically for a entry level job in a government position like a cleaning staff and a peon, which they are really overqualified for. And this reflects two things, in my opinion. The first thing is that these individuals have degrees, but they have no real value in the labor market. Secondly, there are not enough job creators in Bihar. There are many job seekers. And as you know, the population is extremely large. So you can find a lot of people from Bihar migrating elsewhere, working there. A large chunk of the migrant labor is coming from Bihar. So one cannot say that Bihar does not have people willing to work or otherwise not capable of working. And so the bigger problem is that Bihar has a lot of people working in the agriculture sector or in the informal sectors. And they really want to move out to other formal sectors or to industrial work, but they don't have any of those opportunities in Bihar itself. So they have to look for it elsewhere. And so far as the notion that public sector will somehow drive growth and will help Bihar in the long run is concerned, I think it is wrong. It is more an act of desperation on part of the youth there that they want to be employed in these kinds of jobs. So the idea is to create more jobs in the private sector, preferably, so that these people who are not able to be absorbed in the public sector can get another avenue for employment.
So one question that I want to ask you is that this you sort of summarized the unemployment situation in Bihar, but how does it translate to everyday life, right? So I've heard that there are localities or villages, etc., dedicated just for preparing for government jobs, right? So that's just one aspect. how do you think like the daily life in Bihar is kind of interconnected with unemployment, and what do you think is the difference? Like if there was not an unemployment problem in Bihar, what would the situation be like?
Yeah, I think I understand. The basic idea is that Bihar, as of now, has had no experience of a situation where there's plenty of jobs for everyone, sadly, because the public sector has a bottleneck. It cannot employ a lot of people. And people in Bihar really want to be employed in the public sector because of two reasons. Number one is the security of the government offers. And the second is it has been associated with prestige over the years because it has been the only sort of available employment opportunity. But people have migrated elsewhere and they have done well for themselves. But that doesn't mean that the everyday person in Bihar also aspires to do that, because sometimes there's financial constraints, sometimes there's other constraints also. So people are reluctant to leave their like the birthplace and their basically their background in Bihar. So it is a risky proposition. Even if you think that people would want to move out, they really don't have the resources sometimes.
Right. Okay. So let's move on to the next question, which is that you mentioned that, you know, and we mentioned this in our previous podcast also, that Bihar has it's a huge agricultural potential, right? That it lies in the belt of India, which is one of the most fertile regions in the world, not just in India. But it's not been able to capitalize as well as some of the other states in the north. So what do you think is the or are the missing pieces when it comes to Bihar's agricultural output? Um, how can Bihar kind of improve the agricultural output while making sure that people are able to earn substantial amounts of money from the same, so that they have a compounding effect on their generations? What do you think are some ways in which agriculture in Bihar can?
Just like all other countries which pursue commercial farming on a large scale, Bihar too has to ensure that farming is done by few people and that it is done collectively, preferably some form of land aggregation where the people who own the land have some shares in the profit. And basically, you're clubbing the land to farm efficiently, number one, and number two, resource efficiently. So not only is the resource efficiency ensured by less people working on the land and more technology being employed to do that farming, it is also using modern agricultural practices like drip irrigation or crop rotation, or even focusing on certain export oriented crops which generally are not grown because most of the farming is done individually. So people grow only those crops which have local demand or their own reasons for growing those crops. So these are the few things. And another important aspect with Bihar in agriculture is that Bihar still suffers from land disputes and forceful land acquisition by some anti-social elements, and even crimes which are related with basically land disputes like murder, kidnapping. These are all signs of a pre-modern society, which I don't think have any place in the industrial age that we are now living in. And this points to the institutional failure of our courts and the other dispute resolution mechanisms, including the law and order in the region. So, and there's also another factor which is very important when you're looking at land holdings. That is the case of fragmentation of land holdings, where certain families will become completely landless over successive generations because of the division of land the between the people. So clubbing land parcels will solve this and also ensure that there's a shift from the agricultural mode of labor to some other area. Suppose there were 50 workers working on the field earlier. Now there only be 10. So the 40 workers who have now left the fields because of this model will have to then proceed elsewhere, and they'll also have the backing of the share, basically the share that they receive from that farming. So suppose they had 10% of the land, so they'll get say 5% of the total profits. So they'll use that to set up another, maybe a small shop in the region, or maybe they'll move out and pursue higher education. So these are all aspects which we have to look at. And so far as the old status quo is concerned, where there was one farmer with his small parcel of land tilling it, those days I think are gone, and Bihar needs to embrace modern technology to keep up with the rest of the world and the country.
Yeah, that's the interesting thing you mentioned because we covered this in last podcast also, wherein I talked about how Bihar has been facing like a double whammy kind of situation wherein the northern part gets flooded every year, but the southern part is brought low because of lack of irrigational technology. So, I mean, are there any government schemes that have you like noticed this over the last few elections that is there a possibility that, the government has kind of added this in their manifestos that, we need to solve this problem in Bihar where their lands are either, destroyed by floods or destroyed by drought. So, do you think that is the public demanding that problem, the solution to that problem, or has the government kind of included that when they are, you know, when they are kind of going around rallying for their election win. Is this a priority for the government and the people that embracing modern technology, which kind of prevents floods and prevents droughts and increases agricultural output? Has this been a priority for the public and government? And if not, what do you think will make Bihar reach there?
Yeah, I think that's a very valid question to ask because most of us think that governments are supposed to intervene in such instances, and Bihar is no different. But what people in Bihar have come to understand is that given the situation of basically the overall well-being, the standard of living there, they expect the government to only save them when the flood comes. Like they don't expect the government to intervene and prevent the flood from occurring. So their expectations are very low so far as that is concerned. And the reason for that is the government is, I think you can't blame the government because the government's hands are tied. There's very less revenue generation because of the past, because there's so much strain on the population as it is. There's unemployment, there's lack of opportunities. So government does not really have the funds to do all this. And there have been propositions, there have been ideas, but nothing has come of it. And every now and then you'll see that the chief minister right now is also saying that Bihar needs to have a special status wherein the government has to send in extra money so that Bihar can somehow cope with all these problems. So they have no reason to blame themselves because they have no resources to do anything.
Yeah, it makes sense. So now we've discussed about the agricultural problems in Bihar, but I think another aspect why Bihar suffers from unemployment and a lot of the youth is dependent on government jobs is the lack of industrial output. So, like, there are reports or op-eds that I've read that Bihar has huge industrial potential. If it wanted to, like, if there's a possibility that it could have scaled that, much like other states have done, Gujarat, for example. Bihar could have done phenomenally well, but it's not been able to. And I understand that, the government's hands are tied. There's only so much they can do. But do you think that in the future, investing in industries in Bihar, do you think that is like a feasible or a reasonable solution to Bihar's unemployment problem? And if yes, what do you think will help Bihar reach there where there are industries and there are manufacturing jobs available for people to absorb?
Yeah, I think industries are really important for not just Bihar, but for this country as well. And the thing with industries is that industries require a host of factors to be able to thrive, like law and order, electricity, water supply, favorable labor laws, favorable tax regime, and transport solutions as well. And these are parameters where Bihar is lacking as of now. So the question then any investor could ask is why should Bihar be chosen by us to set up an industry? And one reason could be that Bihar has a ready supply of labor and it can cater to the demands of the north and the northeastern parts of the country at the same time because of its strategic location at that juncture. So, but these are the only reasons why Bihar can be preferred over its neighbors, because other states which are neighboring Bihar not only have better facilities, but they also have what one could call mineral resources, which Bihar also has but has not done anything about. And moreover, Bihar has not shaken off the colonial hangover and continues to function in the same way as it did back in those times. Whereas other states have actively taken measures to reform their old measures. So, for instance, the police, the judiciary, and other basic services are not up to the mark in Bihar. And again, if you blame this on the government, it again comes back to the problem of job creation, where job creation drives growth, which in turn drives revenue, which in turn helps the government to improve these services. So Bihar has never gone through the phase of job creation, and it fails to deal with the challenges that it now faces. And I'd like to bring some historical context here because this is important. When the British came to India, they saw that India had a huge amount of domestic demand and that it had set up industries which are small and medium scale to cater to its own domestic demand. And the extra surplus that these industries produced were the major reason behind India's opulence. So they thought, let us first dismantle this structure of industrial, basically industrial demand, so that we can then take over this role that India plays in the world. So back then, even Mahatma Gandhi used to say that Gram Swaraj was a reality and we should bring it back. So that the Gram Swaraj essentially means that India at the macro and the micro level was self-sufficient, which even today people want in the guise of Atmanirbharta. So the question we have to ask is, can Bihar not produce all the things it consumes in Bihar? Now, this is a naive question to ask because in a market economy, you have to produce only that which is advantageous for yourself. But as of now, Bihar has to experiment. It cannot sort of move forward without experimenting with market economies and finding which of these products that it can produce will confer an advantage. So, for instance, the example of Bangladesh is there where they experimented and they found that textile is something that they can really use to advance their industrial potential. So we have to also look at Bihar and its regional realities and find out what are the products which Bihar can produce and produce competitively. So that is one way we can sort of identify these. And once we have done that, once we have created jobs in this way, then automatically the services like education, health, they will automatically improve. And when other companies see that Bihar is showing its industrial potential in this way and it is growing at a reasonable pace, they'll also want to partner with us and they'll want to invest more because in the world of business, you have to show the capabilities first and then you have to sort of expect something from them. So as of now, we have to come back to our roots, I think. And we can do that because India has been an industrial power in the past. Only now it has the potential to reinvent itself and basically fill the demand gap which is present in the world, especially when other countries are losing out on their industrial potential because of many reasons, because of demographic collapse primarily. So we have that advantage in Bihar. We have a young demographic which is coming up, which can take up these jobs and fulfill that demand.
Yeah, that was a very interesting answer. And before I come to the last question, I'll take a short break. Hello, we're back, and we are now moving to the final segment in the podcast where Srijay, like we've discussed a lot of things, right? We've discussed why Bihar needs to up its agricultural game and how can industries, thrive with Bihar and whether it's important or not. And the fact that improving the law and order situation is a very important aspect when it comes to generating more employment. I think the final question that I want to ask you is, we know that there are a lot of solutions to Bihar's unemployment problem, but what are some immediate steps that you think the government should be taking when it comes to improving the unemployment situation? And before you begin with your answer, to anyone who's listening, I want to point out that we've discussed this in the podcast before, wherein we say that it's not the government's responsibility to increase employment or generate jobs, but the fact that we are relying on them to do that is the reason why we need to talk about this in our podcast. That's how bad the situation is. So relying on government to generate jobs is mostly the last resort, and we've come till there. So with that explicitly stated, Srijay, you can begin your answer to this question.
Yeah, I think governments really don't have to step in. And it's a last resort, certainly. But I think my solution that I would think of involves the government, at least in the initial stage. And it goes like this. So first, you have to create a publicly owned corporation, and it has to produce goods which are in high demand in a particular locality, right? For instance, if there's a district A which consumes a lot of electrical switches and it gets them from Chinese imports. So we have to set up a factory to manufacture such switches in that district itself. And the cost of setting up and running these factories will initially be borne by the government, but I'm sure that this cost will eventually go down because of the demand. And the people that these factories will employ will be all locals. And they will also have a share in the profit of these corporations by virtue of being shareholders. But the problem here is of technology. So to solve that, one proposition is that we could have technology sharing between the states. So for instance, West Bengal produces iron zippers, which are used in clothing in a very competitive manner. So the government of West Bengal can sign an MOU with the Bihar government to share that technology. And the situation is that there's mutual demand in both states. So they don't effectively compete with each other because of that. So the technology sharing will not hamper the revenue of the factory in West Bengal, and the factory in Bihar will not compete with it in such a way that it will hamper the. So like this, we can increase the technology sharing bit by bit, and we can start small, obviously, and prioritize in terms of demand. So the idea is to find out what are the products which are in demand in a certain locality, in a certain region, and then start focusing on producing that locally. The second aspect which will help this kind of a strategy is the farmers who've become the shareholders of the aggregated farmland, they will have to be employed somewhere. So these industries serve as that. And because farmland aggregated like that will have very less employment opportunity because it'll be automated for the most part. There'll be very less, if anything, it'll be a supervisory kind of a role that many people will have in those kinds of setups. So all of these people who have the backing of the profits that are getting from their farmland can also be employed in these industries. And basically the idea is to produce whatever we can. And eventually we will identify what are the products where we can sort of specialize in. And at that stage, when we come to that stage, there will be other companies who will be looking at this development and they'll be more interested in investing. Right now, if you told a company to invest in Bihar, it'd be very averse to it because there's a lot of risk involved. But once we set up these corporations, there'll be a precedent. So these companies will certainly be more inclined to invest. And lastly, people will be convinced because of this development that in an industrial way of life where a factory worker is better paid and more capable of supporting his or her family is better than what they are facing now, where there's unemployment and there is farm crop failure and all of these other situations that Bihar faces. And this is a gradual process, obviously, but I think this is the way forward. We really want to consider an immediate solution.
Yeah, thanks a lot for that answer. I agree too that it's going to be a long road, but the important part or an important step is to just, start doing something about it. And with that, I think we'll end our podcast. Thanks a lot, Srijay, for joining me this podcast. And thanks to everyone who listened to it. And we'll be back with another podcast. Thank you.
If you liked our show, don't forget to check out other interesting podcasts on the IVM network. You can tune into them on the IVM Podcast app, ivmpodcast.com, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. You can also follow IVM on social media. The handle is @IVM Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And hey, if you'd like to dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs, check us out at our Twitter handle @TakshashilaINST or our website takshashila.org.in.